Welcome everybody who's joining. It's great to have you as we launch this year's webinar series. This year we're focusing on frontiers in ethnobotany. And I'll take a moment just as people enter. As you're entering, it would be great if you could enter your name and where you're joining us from in the chat. And also, as you're listening to Cassandra, Dr. Quave, sorry, it's Quave, correct?
Quave, yes.
Yeah. If you have questions, you can enter them in the Q&A because it can be hard for me to follow in the chat, and then we'll set aside some time at the end of the conversation. So anyway, it's great to have so many of you joining. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and start by just sharing my screen.
It's from all over, from LA to Florida to Canada, New York. It's fantastic.
Awesome. Yeah, so welcome. It's my real honor to be launching this webinar series by speaking with Dr. Quave, Cassandra Quave. We're going to be talking about a whole bunch of stuff, her research and other things, and especially about her new book, which The Plant Hunter. And this webinar series is made possible with the generous support of the Sustainable Herbs Program underwriters and inaugural underwriters and donors. And you can find out more information about all of these companies on the Sustainable Herbs Program website. And it's also made possible through the generous support of ABC members. And in being a member of the American Botanical Council, you really help make possible all the programming that is offered. And you can find out a lot more about that programming, as well as the wealth of resources they have at the website herbalgram.org. So with that, hold on. Great. So again, welcome everyone to this conversation with Dr. Quave. And again, welcome everyone joining from all around the world. Please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. So Cassandra Quave is a herbarium curator and associate professor of dermatology and human health at Emory University. She's also the co-founder and CEO of Phytotech, which is a drug discovery company dedicated to developing solutions from botanicals. And I mentioned that just because the weaving together both of the engagement in research for applied uses as well as academic work. And she's also, as I mentioned, the author of this really fantastic book, The Plant Hunter. And I encourage all of you to read this. It's a really highly readable and engaging story of so many threads, but what it's like to be a woman facing all the different challenges that you faced with medical issues, as well as just navigating a very male world and keeping true to the values that matter to you, as well as the real rigor of your research. So I love the weaving together of your personal story with that research and the really important work that you're doing. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much. So maybe to start, can you just talk some about the research that you're doing, that you're particularly doing and your lab is doing?
It's great. So I guess I would describe myself as a medical ethnobotanist. I'm very interested in the ways that people use plants as medicine. And the real thrust of our research group is looking at medicinal plants that are used in traditional medicine for infectious and inflammatory disease, and really trying to uncover how those medications work. What are the compounds that are responsible for the activities? What microbes are they effective against? What's their safety profile look like, both in terms of metabolism, but also cytotoxicity against human cells? And what are some of the potential ways that we might be able to bring these discoveries to a broader public?
So how first, wow, as a non, my understanding is all much more cultural. And so I'm curious how you decide how to narrow in on the topics that you'll focus on.
Yeah, so I guess my interest in infectious disease really stems from my own personal experiences. I almost died from a life-threatening infection at the age of 3, and I've dealt with ongoing health problems because of my skeletal deformities, but also because of the need to use prosthetics. A prosthetic leg to walk with has led to, recurrent kind of skin infections in my life. And so at the same time, as I went through my education, I became more and more aware of some of the challenges that we face today in infectious disease. I'm a big fan of history. And when you think about the wide scope of the history of medicine, we've only been in the antibiotic era for, under a century, so not even 100 years. Before that, in what we call the pre-antibiotic era, it wasn't so uncommon to fall really seriously ill due to an infection following childbirth, or just from a simple scratch that you get while working in your garden. And these infections could lead to death. And so when antibiotics came around, it really was a game changer in medicine. At the same time, many of those therapies are, we're losing their potency. They're no longer working the way that they were designed to work because of the rise of antibiotic resistance. And so when I think about the toolkit that I have at hand, our understanding of plants and how they're used as medicine, our understanding of plant natural products and the chemistries that plants have, and also our understanding of how people have leveraged those chemistries to deal with infection over the centuries, that's kind of the nexus at which I work, is really trying to see, okay, where are we going to find the next generation of medicines? When you think about what really is traditional knowledge is something that's built up over centuries and generation after generation of sharing things that work. I like to liken it to, something that many people can identify with, maybe grandma's, favorite recipe. Let's say it's apple pie, and she learned this recipe from her mother and her mother before her. And maybe that recipe changes a little bit from generation to generation. Maybe somebody adds a little extra pinch of one flavor, cinnamon or nutmeg. Another one likes to make the crust thicker. But the general recipe remains intact. Traditional knowledge works in much the same way. Medicinal applications of plants are shared from generation to generation, and there might be small tweaks along the way, but we only pass on things that seem to work for us. So we're already starting from a really rich body of knowledge to begin our search from. I mean, another thing that's important to note is we have around 374,000 species of plants on Earth. The estimates go from 374 to 390, more or less. But amazingly, over centuries, humans have sorted out that roughly 9% of those plants, or around 33,000, have a medicinal application. But scientists have only really looked in depth at maybe a few hundred of those. So there's just vast territory to explore. I mean, when we talk about the great frontier, there's so much to explore when it comes to plant life on Earth.
Why is that? Why is it only 300? Why do you think?
Of a few hundred that have been investigated. I mean, you could say that there
because it kind of also relates, I mean, the question in asking that, thinking about your focus in a world where it's not necessarily the same focus. So you're bringing this in, right? And
yeah.
So both answers, I guess.
Yeah. So I guess, you could probably estimate the numbers of plants that have been given a cursory look in the laboratory, probably in the low thousands. But what I'm talking about is really a rigorous scientific investigation of really looking to the chemistry, really evaluating the bioactivity, of taking those deeper steps. In many cases, that hasn't happened for most medicinal plants. I think part of the reason is this kind of research is challenging. There are inherent challenges when it comes to the ability to mine that chemistry. You need pretty advanced, tools, analytical chemistry tools to be able to tease through these. You need to have research infrastructures that can enable you to apply these advanced, biochemical modalities to exploring plants. And what we see in today's kind of research landscape is that in some of the world's hottest spots of biodiversity, there are 36 terrestrial hotspots of biodiversity. around the globe. And many of those hotspots happen to be in places where there's very poor access to research infrastructure. And so one of my, messages in this book is that we need to do more to increase research capacity in these sites through working in collaboration with local scientists and finding mechanisms of funding and kind of network building to increase not only the availability of tools to study these plants in the countries where these plants are from, but also to give more access to training in these advanced skill sets to scientists around the globe. And I think that really is my ultimate mission and vision. If I think about the big scope of where I want to go with my career, that's what I really want to stand up for, is to really increase that research capacity in terms of infrastructure and training in these biodiversity hotspots.
That's great. I want to come back around to that. But before that, I'd love to go back to your sort of personal journey. And I was really struck by the story of, I think it was your first or second time, maybe a second trip down to the Amazon, and when your leg got infected. And I just, how hard and challenging when you just wanted to be able to walk and not have to deal with the infection. And yeah, so if you could talk some about your first experience in the Amazon and kind of how that has informed your approach and your perseverance too, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm no stranger to issues with disability. I mean, in addition to my amputation of my leg at a young age, I also had a slew of other orthopedic defects. So my hip had to be completely rebuilt. My femur had to be lengthened. My spine became incredibly curved, an S-shaped curve that required, my spine to be straightened with the insertion of rods. So there are a number of physical limitations I deal with on a day-to-day basis that I have to account for. And now picture that I'm living my dream. I'm in the Amazon for the first time. And, one of the challenges in wearing a prosthetic leg is the propensity for skin infections, because especially in areas where you have a lot of sweat and a lot of friction, right? So you can imagine just rubbing on very sensitive skin over and over in a hot, sweaty environment. It really is, just the perfect storm for those types of infections to emerge. And so I found myself bedridden within my first few days in the Amazon. And what was most frustrating for me, it was just, again, being in this situation where I was stuck looking out at this amazing world and not able to engage in it in the way that I wanted to. And I mean, that happened in childhood for me as well. I had, one, in some cases, 2 surgeries a year from the age of 3 to probably 18 to have my body rebuilt so that I could walk and get around. And I mean, in some ways, those experiences shaped the scientist I am today. It shaped my understanding of medicine and what it is to be a patient, what it is to suffer. And I think as a medical ethnobotanist, it gives me a unique perspective when I work with healers and speak with people that use medicines of many different forms, whether it's in ritual healing or the use of medicinal plants, because there's a shared sense of, I don't want to say shared sense of suffering, but in a way it is. It's this shared journey that I have. And those times of immobility, as a child, really fostered this time where I spent a lot of time dedicated to watching nature and observing all the tiny intricacies happening at my feet in the grass, the ants crawling around, or looking up in the trees at birds and just observing things. And I think that's probably the greatest gift you can give any child is giving them the time and space to observe nature and really reflect on it, because I think that's really what forms the best kinds of scientists, is just being careful observers and to appreciate what you see around you. And so that kind of is what put me on that path.
I love those 2 themes and the qualities of becoming a scientist, the deep empathy, and that's what I took from your story, and observation, because often it's the third leg of the stool maybe that's focused on, which is like intellectual rigor, which is important, but without those observation and an open heart,
Yeah,
it gets.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, in my training until that point, before I went to the Amazon, was very much based in hard Western paradigms of science. I mean, because of those lived experiences, the only forms of medicine I really knew were, based on surgery and on pharmacology. So drug or cut, that's medicine. And it was in the Amazon working with an amazing healer and teacher and friend, Don Antonio Montero Pisco, that my eyes were really open to this other world of healing that brought together not only kind of the pharmacology end, because remember, plant medicine is pharmacology. In fact, many of our leading drugs that we use today were originally discovered in plants. They may be produced in a pharmaceutical setting today, but those chemical blueprints were found originally in plants. And so I really gained a better appreciation for pharmacology, for his ability also to be really in tune with nature, because his observations of nature were also part of his diagnostic process when he was trying to figure out what was wrong with his patient and how to best help his patient. But there were also, ritual and spiritual elements to healing that I hadn't really encountered before. That really, again, it was kind of this awakening in me of like, these are other ways. There are other ways that medicine and health can happen, different from what I'd been raised with them.
And again, there's so many threads I want to follow up in, but one in particular, I'm wondering whether to wait, but so there's this mode in ethnobotany, especially more economic ethnobotany, when it was really attached to the colonial empire and going out and extracting and bringing back and plants for the benefit of those in the first world who had the resources to travel. And I'm curious, as the younger generation of ethnobotanists, how you think about that power and political dynamic, and both in your networks, I know with other ethnobotanists that you have colleagues, and also as a ethnobotanist yourself.
Yeah, I think there's been an awakening in the past few years around decolonizing ethnobotany, and I think it's really exciting. I think that more and more people are recognizing, again, the need, the necessity for really working in truly collaborative ways, that it's not an extractive process, it's a collaboration, not an extraction. And also, we now have better guidelines that are widely available through the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing that people can turn to learn how to best navigate some of these systems. At the same time, it's also important, I think, to set expectations. None of the work that we've done in the lab has led to any, billion-dollar drugs or streams of money at this point, and they may never do that. But there's still value in the work that we do because we're able to bring back what we learn about how these medicines work and how safe they are back to the communities. And so the way that I approach access and benefit sharing is really from day one of, obviously having informed consent at both the community and the individual level, but also working closely with different organizers within those communities and trying to get a better understanding from day one about what would they like to get out of these types of collaborations. In many cases, it's a return of that knowledge. Like, what can you bring back to us? What can you tell us about what you discover in the lab? Can you take, it's not just sending them some very complicated scientific paper in another language. It's bringing the knowledge back in a way in their language in an accessible form is one of the key things that we do. We also lead workshops near the end of our field study to kind of talk with the community about what we've documented, giving community members a chance also to debate, well, you say it works like this, but my grandma taught me that it works like this, and really getting into this intricacies. And what I love the most about those types of gatherings too, is it really brings back this resurgence of pride in their heritage and pride in their knowledge, and an awakening also in some of the younger generations that don't always think much about, grandma's remedy for this or that shows them this is really important. So I think, in having that emphasis on ensuring that knowledge is able to be returned to communities is important. And then another way that we try to engage with access and benefit sharing, again, in the absence of, revenue streams from economic applications of this work, is also through fostering long-term collaborations with scientists in those countries. And I'll just give you an example of some of our ongoing work in the Balkans and Kosovo with Professor Avni Haidari of the University of Pristina. So we've been collaborating now for more than a decade, and we're able to raise funds collaboratively together by going, applying to different opportunities through the US State Department, which basically, the money is not coming to my group, it's going to them to enable them to travel to my lab and to learn the techniques in my lab. And then later we were able to secure some funding through the USAID funded peer program. And so for any scientists that are listening, that are tuning in right now, I really encourage you to investigate this peer mechanism. If you have funding from the National Institutes of Health or from the National Science Foundation, and you're interested in building out collaborations with, there are certain countries on the list that are eligible, but this kind of funding mechanism goes to your partners and really enables them to buy key equipment to help build up their research infrastructure in a way that would otherwise not be possible because of a lack of funding for research in many of these countries. And so I think there's a lot that we can do, even in the absence of having millions of dollars, of some product being generated. At the same time, if there are possibilities for these to be rolled out into a commercial line, we have agreements to come to agreements, basically, that, if things do yield promising results, that there will be ways to negotiate and ensure that those communities are, receive equitable benefits.
Mm-hmm. That's great to hear. Can you talk a little, do you have any examples or memories of times when you have gone back with the knowledge, when you've shared it in a community, and anything that struck you or any ahas from that?
Yeah, I think one of the first kind of events that was really meaningful for me was, I conducted my field research for my dissertation in a small village in Italy and worked in the surrounding communities. And through our collaborations with other research partners, including Professor Andrea Pironi, who's now at the University of Slow Food outside of Turin in Bra, they were able to secure funds to print this book, which I wrote, that was in Italian and English at the request of the communities, and also with some of the local ethnic minority language of Armbrecht for the plant names. And so basically I took what had become my dissertation, but made it into more of an accessible kind of photo, almost like a cookbook, but not quite, just with information that was easy for community members to look at. And I had a lot of photos of many of the healers and elders that I was fortunate to work with during that time. And that was just so incredibly special because, from the time that I did my research until, a few years later, when I wrote this book and brought it back, many of these elders had passed on. And it was so very meaningful to be able to give this to their families and, talk with them about this and see the excitement and the pride in showing that their parent or their grandparents' legacy lived on and now is being used still today in some of the village schools as an educational resource to teach children about their cultural heritage of how they use plants.
It's a slightly different thing, but I was speaking with a woman who works for an essential oil producer group in the Sudan, and how they've pursued things like certified organic and certified for fair wild, not necessarily because it brings more money, but because it gives them these tools and skill set that they wouldn't otherwise get. And then they have that regardless of the additional income. And so these other ways of, deeper relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that there's so much potential for pathways to economic development. I mean, this is not an area that I would consider myself an expert in, but I think, again, especially in the Balkans, where a lot of the wild, wild crafting of herbs that go into trade in Europe and beyond happens in these mountain ranges. And the truth is that local people receive very little money. It's often children too that are out, harvesting everything from wild orchids to cowslip to, yarrow, that go through these series of middlemen into trade. And I think there has to be better ways to ensure that communities can reap more benefit from this. Also, better ways to ensure that those populations of plants are maintained in a sustainable way. And again, it's not an area where I have a lot of specific expertise, but my hope is that in our work with documenting knowledge, that this can perhaps be used by other scientists and other kind of nonprofit organizations as a launching pad to provide that baseline information they need to try and implement some of these types of initiatives.
And by offering more meaningful ways to engage in it, right? Because just like harvesting to sell to some trader, that's not very meaningful work.
Exactly.
Who wants that for their kids? And
exactly. Yeah, it's a really good point.
And gets back to the point you were making before about connecting that capacity building in biodiversity hotspots, right? To get more research.
Yeah, I mean, imagine, I just think that there could be such a great cascade effect, both with, within the scientific community in the countries that are home to these biodiversity hotspots, but also to local economic development that could spin out from this. I think that's really where we need to go in the future. Again, and it's part of that decolonizing science is like, how do we build these supportive research networks, and train the next generation of scientists in this way.
Yeah. I want to come back to another point you made earlier about your experience in the Amazon and a story you tell in the book about when, I think, was it Don Juan, his name, but okay, sorry, did the healing ceremony for your leg was when you were sick, and how that, both a little bit about that experience, but also how that experience has informed your work ever since, especially because a lot of your time is now collecting plants and in a lab. And so it's a different way of knowing.
Yeah, I mean, so in this particular healing ceremony, there were a number of different ritual elements to it, from kind of singing and whistling, the use of a shakapa bundle, which is a bundle of periana leaves that have this kind of rattly noise when they're shaken. This is in the absence of any kind of hallucinogenic, plants, although Don Antonio did use ayahuasca as a way of diagnosing his patients and also as a way of determining which medicines to give them. So I know that today ayahuasca is also being given to patients in different settings. I'm not fully comfortable with the way that ayahuasca is currently being used, and these kind of tourist type outposts. I think there's some concerns around safety, especially for anyone that's on medication for mental health because of counterindications. But in his sense, he took this as a way of divining both what is the cause of the problem or the pain, and then also to divine how to treat people. And he was very intuitive and very, very empathetic and very in line with his patients. And for me, this healing ceremony just really brought a great deep sense of peace for me. I mean, I was in physical pain from my leg, but I was really facing a lot of psychological pain of not, and a lot of indecision in my life. This is really a turning point in my life where, up until this point, or really even in that point, I was kind of on this path towards medical school. This is what I always felt that I should become. It was who I looked up to growing up because, I was in the hospital all the time. My heroes were my doctors, and, just on this path, but not quite seeing that any other paths could be open. And I think it was a combination of those interactions with Don Antonio and kind of when the reality finally hit me in the face and I had the letter of acceptance to medical school, that it finally hit me that that was not the path for me. So he really helped me find the path that's brought me to today. And looking back in retrospect, I've been successful with our research enterprise. And I mean, but I didn't know that back then. Everything was so uncertain, and it's been a very winding path that's brought me to this point, for sure. There was no security that what I was leaping into was going to be a good choice.
And you communicate that really well in the book. Like, it's amazing. I'm like, wow, you just keep going and going. It's very impressive. And also a time when I think when you shifted to a different lab that was not so plant focused, and you mentioned that different experience of seeing plants in this broader perspective rather than just chemicals through a microscope. Can you talk some about those differences in your work?
Yeah, so I think, through graduate school and into my postdoctoral training, my main research was focused on, documenting the plants that were used in traditional medicine in southern Italy for infectious and inflammatory skin disease. And, what I found in the laboratory, I was actually learning from these traditional medicines in new ways, because the paradigm of antibiotics that we still kind of stand under today is that these are drugs that should either kill bacteria, and as broad spectrum as possible. We will wipe out, like, the most broad spectrum is what's been preferred, meaning that the antibiotics that kill the most types of bacteria or slow down their growth. And what I was finding was, there were plants that I documented as being used in traditional remedies for skin infections that did not kill or slow down the bacteria that would have been associated with those types of infections. And so this realization brought me to other questions. Well, like, is this nonsense? Like, why do they keep putting this on their skin? Or is there some question I haven't yet asked? And that's when we started thinking about, other potential ways these plants might be working. And what I ended up focusing on during that period was looking at the ability of these, of these extracts and isolated compounds to block what's known as bacterial quorum sensing. So quorum sensing is when bacteria, it's basically chemical signaling between organisms, and it's a way that they coordinate their behavior. If you think about a bacterium, it's small, the single cell on their own, they're really at their most vulnerable. When they're the most powerful in terms of being able to invade your body or spread in the body, it's when they can coordinate their actions. So instead of just one little cell producing a little bit of toxin, they communicate and say, okay, everyone turn on your toxins all at once. And then you have this horde of, an army releasing all these poisons into your body. And that's what leads to your tissue damage and spread in the body and really severe kind of forms of infection. And so what I was finding was that some of these plants acted by blocking that communication system. I mean, how amazing is that?
So
It's
cool.
like, instead of just killing everything, they targeted these organisms, and without killing them, basically shut down their ability to cause harm. And that, in effect, could give the immune system time to work on clearing out the infection. Or if you're taking another plant that perhaps does act with killing activity or slowing down the growth, then you could have other kind of combination effects at play. And so I think the plants were teaching me a lot. And one lesson I really try and bring forward to my students is that we can't think about science in terms of a box. What I mean by this is that, creative science is often deemed as, oh, that's thinking outside of the box. Well, my argument is, if you're positioning your science either inside or outside of a box, you've already lost the game. There is no box. You can't operate with that mentality. I think, again, it goes back to that kind of ability to be rigorous in your scientific explorations, but also open-minded enough and humble enough to realize that not only you may not have all the right answers, but you also maybe will never in your lifetime come up with all the right questions. And that's kind of the approach I try to teach my students, and that's okay, but we need to be open-minded to think about some of these other things. So when I talk about rigorous evaluation of plants, so many haven't been fully evaluated because we still don't, number one, have the right questions to ask of them, and number two, we haven't developed the right scientific tools yet to ask them. But at the same time, we have some pretty cool scientific tools to play with today. I mean, I think that the advances we've seen, especially in analytical chemistry, around the ability to look at these complex mixtures through mass spectrometry, our ability to resolve very complicated structures through NMR, and our abilities to look at crystal structures of compounds, and now even crystal structures found in mixed powders of compounds through cryo-EM micro-ED, which is a new emerging field that I'm so excited about. And I think that this is really going to help us unlock the door to a lot of these complex mixtures.
Can you say why and like for a layer?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the biggest challenges we have is, there are a number of kind of what we would call ubiquitous compounds found in plants. So many in the audience may have heard of something like quercetin or ferulic acid or caffeic acid, these kind of phenolic acids that are found in many different plants. And you can identify those through the use of standards and HPLC and kind of basic, chromatographic techniques. But where the real mysteries lie are in all of those unknowns. And a single plant tissue has hundreds of molecules, hundreds of distinct compounds. And so it's tapping into all of those unknowns that's really been the challenge and a major bottleneck, I think, in the field. And, we have had more success in recent years in my lab through some really kind of simple, ingenious tools, including Legos, where we've used tools like the Lego Mindstorms robotic kind of set to build our own large scale open bed fraction collectors. We just published this, I think it was last year in ACS Analytical Chemistry with instructions. And again, it's another example of research capacity building because we were able to show others across the globe how to build this cheap resource tool that can really enable purification of compounds from complex mixtures. And I've gotten emails from all around the world where people are building this, and it's a lot of fun to build. I mean, who doesn't love playing with Legos? But it also has opened up, tools that otherwise wouldn't be accessible because of the sheer expense to researchers.
Mm-hmm. How do you, I love what you're saying around the box and not a box. How do you share with your students, like, okay, you have these questions, how do you follow them without a box? What's the thread that you would, what advice do you give?
So I think it's important to be informed. So operating without outside of the box or without a box, you still need to have a very strong understanding of the current state of science. But you also need to have a very strong understanding, in my opinion, of the history of science. Where have we come? If you look back, there's so many, amazing nuggets of wisdom. And I talk about this in the book around paradigm shifts in medicine, things that we take for granted today. Let's talk about germ theory. It took, I don't know how many centuries for people to recognize that, or even the theory of spontaneous generation to recognize that life didn't just emerge on its own out of a slab of dead meat. And when it came to germ theory, when you think about pioneers like, Van Leeuwenhoek, who was a lens crafter, he was the first person to be able to see tiny things like, protozoa, sperm, red blood cells. Imagine being that person on Earth, and you're the only person that's been able to see these because others couldn't replicate his level of precision in his lenses. These things don't just happen though immediately. Many of these paradigm shifts took centuries in order to capture broad acceptance. And then, not only the acceptance that there are microscopic creatures, but these microscopic creatures have the capacity to cause harm. You can look at, scientists or physicians like Semmelweis, who was an obstetrician. And this is a time when physicians would go from delivering a baby after doing an autopsy on a mother that had just died of what they called childbed fever or streptococcal infection, then go to the next mother with dirty, blood-stained clothes and hands without washing their hands, and then basically kill the next mother in line with these infectious agents. Or Lister, who really pioneered surgery. I mean, they were ridiculed and just pushed aside because people couldn't believe it. And in a way, I feel like plants have been ridiculed across the board because of, medicinal plants fall into these different categories of, sometimes they're used in misinformation. There can be a lot of marketing hype, but what we really need to do is bring forward the real science. What can we show with our scientific tools? And there's a lot to show. And I think there's a lot to remind people of, that many of these medicines did originate in plants. And there's many, many more medicines I know are waiting just to be discovered.
Can you talk some about, so when you discover some healing qualities in a plant, how is that different from something synthesized in a lab? And just again, for a non-science, non-expert.
So, I think what's important to understand when it comes to chemistry, a chemical is a chemical, right? So let's take the example of vanilla extract versus artificial vanilla extract. Both of those contain the compound vanillin, one of which may be synthetically derived and one of which is part of a more complex extract from the plant. Now, if you've ever made your own homemade vanilla extract, which is very simple and fun, by the way, just stick it into a bottle of vodka and you have this, lovely extract. You'll note that the flavor profile of your natural vanilla extract has much more depth. There are other notes of sensation you have when you consume that. And that's because it's not just a single compound in the vanilla. It's a mixture of many different compounds, and all of those come together to form that bouquet of flavor, that bouquet of aroma. Whereas vanillin, which you might find in your kind of artificial extract, has that kind of core, smell, aroma, flavor of vanilla, but it lacks all those other complexities, right? But in the end, the vanillin that's produced in a factory versus the vanillin that comes out of the plant, those compounds are exactly the same structurally. The difference is all the other stuff, all those other compounds that are found in that complex extract. And nature works through complexity. I think that's the other important lesson, is that our current status of medicine is about single drugs against single targets or single pathways in the body. But nature inherently works through many different compounds, often hitting many different targets. And I think that's another challenge that we face when it comes to antimicrobial resistance, is that we've kept trying to hit these organisms with a single compound. And maybe what we need are cocktails, and really plants in a way provide their own kind of innate cocktail therapies. It's just finding the right plants and figuring out how to get them at concentrations, the extracts or the refined fractions at the right concentrations to yield the potent activity that you need, but also the safety profiles that you need. Because not everything that's natural is safe. There are so many plants that can kill bacteria. I'll give you or other microbes. I'll give you the example of, oleandrin, and it's being purported for COVID. And I spoke out about this because, yes, while oleandrin works in a cell-based model and may not show toxicity in a cell-based model, it's a well-known cardiotoxic agent. So in a whole person, the levels of oleandrin that are needed to block replication of the COVID virus of SARS-CoV-2 would be at levels that would be very toxic to your heart and could lead to death. So I think this balance between what works in a lab, what is actually safe, how that's translating to safe medicine, that's where pharmacology, serious pharmacology and clinical trials need to come into play.
Wanted to touch on slightly before the point when you were talking about complexity and biodiversity and human health. Can you talk, I know that's a real theme also in the work you're doing and the research. Can you talk some about that connection
between biodiversity
and human health?
Yeah.
Why it matters.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is really important because we're currently in a biodiversity crisis. We're also in a language crisis where many of our indigenous languages are at risk. So with languages goes knowledge of how people have used the natural world in these different cultures. And many of our plants are at risk because of a number of factors ranging from climate change to over-harvesting practices, to expansion of human populations, transition of natural landscapes into agricultural domains. There are lots of different factors that are putting many of these species at risk. And in order to understand human health, I think it's important to recognize that planetary health, the health of Earth, and our health as humans is intertwined. We can't have one without the other. So the idea that you could just continue to destroy habitats, continue to, make these ecosystems places that are intolerable for plants to grow, you're not going to have an opportunity for healthy human lifespans in that kind of environment. And so I think, this is important for people to recognize how close their future is intertwined with their environment. And part of the problem, I believe, is that, many people in the world have zero relationship with nature. And it doesn't, when I say that, it doesn't have to be about building a relationship by traveling to exotic places in the world. I'm talking about walking outside of your home and laying in the grass and looking at what's growing there in the ground cover, or observing what types of trees are in your neighborhood, or what types of epiphytes are growing on those trees, and observing the relationships the animals have with plants, and just getting to know the organisms that you coexist with. Because right now, for many people, these organisms are just a blanket of green. It's like there's, and if you've ever had the opportunity to go on a hike with a botanist, and botanists are my favorite people to hike with because, number one, they're very slow, which is good for me as an amputee. The reason they're slow is we're stopping every few steps to look at something. It's some neat flower we spot in the underbrush, or we're looking up at fruits and trees. And, there's so much joy in that process, because then when you walk again in another ecosystem, it's like you meet friends, right? And I have this odd habit. I talk to plants. I'm also an avid tree hugger. So a shameless tree hugger. I just love that connection that you can get from engaging with the world. And my hope is that more and more people will, venture out and try and build some relationships, because I think once you have a relationship with your world, that's when you can really start thinking and understanding, what does it mean to have a healthy planet?
I love how so much of what you're sharing is about the qualities, not just about the content. And I'm curious, as a mentor for the students in your lab, as well as a professor, how you impart those qualities, what you try, because it's a lot of it's an experiential. It's not really you can teach really, and
Yeah.
I think about that a lot too. How you create the experience so that students have their own. Oh yeah, this is how to see or something.
That's a great point. So, I mean, I started off at Emory teaching some small classes, less than 20 students, and now they've expanded. Most years they get around 100, which is a big size for our school for elective classes. Most classes around 30 students. And it's presented some unique challenges in how to engage such a large group of students. But what I've done and what I feel like really helps them build these connections is we do a lot of experiential learning in class. So it's not just lecture, we also show some videos of how people in different cultures use plants, but then I also get the students out of their seats and working with plants. So it's not a laboratory class, but I kind of call them demos, but we are tasting things, like it's like, for example, looking at Syncypillum dulciferum, or the miracle fruit, and trying trying the acidic foods with those, and having them really feel that sensation of change in sweetness perception. Or it's, making our own chapstick or skin balms with different herbal infusions in class, or making tinctures, trying kava, like all these experience, learning how to use a chewing stick like miswak, because these are things that are, just so abstract in some ways when you're reading about it in your textbook, and it just giving them that sensory experience is really important. And I also like to take them on plant walks when I can. I think that's another way to really encourage them to observe nature. So I've had classes where the activity might be that they find a place to sit in the woods and, kind of write a poem or draw something or take photos of things. So just really getting people to stop and observe and disconnect from the technology. I've got 3 of my kids are teenagers, so I know I'm very familiar with how college students are constantly on their phones. And I'm like, no, put the phone away, look, experience, feel, touch, immerse yourself in these sensations. I think that's one of the big first steps in getting people to really have that experience of connection. And they have to be guided through it, because we're just not taught that.
Yeah, it's interesting what we are taught. And then in listening to your journey, that the most powerful teachers were not necessarily the things you were taught.
Mm-hmm.
The experiences allowed you to glean from what you were taught. I wonder, so there are a number of questions. Many of them are specific or kind of around colonial cultural encounter. I feel like maybe, I don't know if there's anything more you want to say. I feel like you addressed that, talking about how to work in cross-cultural settings.
I think, again, I think that the work has to be taken very intentionally. Again, what I teach my students is we're not a fly in and out kind of research group, right? Where you just kind of helicopter in and do some ethnobotany and leave. This is about building lasting relationships with local students and local professors and local communities, and maintaining these relationships over a long period. And that takes an investment of time. I think it's really valuable, and such a great way, again, to bolster research capacity in country, and also advance our understanding of the science of botanicals.
And it goes back to your point before about the collaborative, not extractive, just to, even just thinking about that question, how is it not extractive? What is extractive in this exchange?
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts so there's general students that you teach, but then also those who really want to go into this work, and what kind of advice or thoughts do you share with them? Either those sort of more traditional ethnobotany, but also the kind that you're doing, which is to me, it seems like a real blend of a lot of different.
Yeah. I mean, I think the advice I give to students that are interested in ethnobotany, and again, just a reminder to the audience that not all ethnobotanists are focused on medicinal plants. There's amazing work done on how plants are used for food, for clothing, for all these other myriad ways, or even, ethnobotany on transmission of knowledge and how knowledge systems are preserved. There's ethnobotanists that focus more in activism and indigenous land rights. I mean, it's an amazing umbrella field because it pulls from so many different core disciplines. And what I do encourage students to do is to really find their core sense of passion. Like, is there a core strength? Like, maybe you are really interested in linguistics, build up that strength in linguistics, and then perhaps expand out or collaborate with others that can complement those strengths in linguistics. Or maybe it's chemistry or biology or whatever it is kind of think about how you can use those core skills to approach some of these major issues. And I mean, ethnobotany, I think, is a incredibly valuable field for a lot of different areas of urgency that we have right now in science, including climate change, including, issues with global food security, including, as we've discussed now, medicines, there's just a lot of ways that the field can be applied, and I think, and really make important contributions to science.
In your book, you say ethnobotany is a signal of hope. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, that for me is what it really is. It's a signal of hope, in that it's a recognition of that human nature interface, of how we are part of this world, we are part of nature, we are not away from it. I think so much of also these kind of colonial perspectives was nature in some way was the enemy that you must whack through and, like, you know, beat your way through, tame these environments. And you know, that's not what ethnobotany is today. I think that it's, you know, and I'm glad for it.
What do you love most about your work?
Wow. You know, I love the opportunities to learn, and I'm continuously learning in this job, and not just from contemporaries in the field or older professors, but also from my students and from the community members that I work with. I think that's probably the most alluring thing for me is, you know, being able to learn from different perspectives, and also, you know, just be able to interact with so many different people from across the globe. Sorry, my youngest just got home from the school bus. So, and okay, hi, okay. I'm gonna yeah, I love the joy of discovery. I mean, it's really an amazing thing to be able to start with on the ground, working with local communities, trying to understand what plants are using for healing. And then I just feel so incredibly thankful that I've been able to pull together a laboratory and a laboratory team that can then take it that extra step to understand, you know, how does this work? How safe is it? What are the mechanisms at play? What are the compounds at play? And to be able to bring that back to communities, that for me is really something that's incredibly rewarding.
Well, your work is incredibly inspiring. Again, I encourage everyone to read her book, because you're not shy at all about the challenges of doing this work as a woman, of navigating financial, you know, raising funding. You know, I had no idea when you were talking about like buying the equipment for your lab. And I think then that also informs how you're collaborating with partners around the world, because you didn't come in having it all set up.
Yeah, I mean, we were like, we're kind of like the dumpster diver lab. I mean, in some ways we continue to do that. I like, you know, if I see something broken in the hallway that someone's trying to throw out, I mean, I can't help myself. I mean, that's, I guess, also part of the way I was raised. You know, my dad had a workshop out back and was constantly welding and, you know, repairing things. And, you know, I married a man that also is similarly skilled in like kind of rebuilding equipment. But I have definitely an appreciation for, you know, I've been there when you don't have the equipment that you need and you're so desperate to get to that next level in your science. And when you have those roadblocks, I mean, science is really expensive. Some of the basic pieces of equipment that I needed in my lab, you know, are $80,000 to $100,000 pieces of equipment. That's, you know, that's a lot of money. And you know, I talk in the book about some of the challenges that I personally face, but you know, there are challenges, of course, across academia that, you know, experts have written at length, you know, about some of the challenges that women face with regards to access to funds, you know, and lab space. And I think that my journey has been a bit more difficult because I've really been seen as an outsider, you know, of the kind of science that I do. I took a lot of time in my early career just trying to establish myself and educate grant reviewers about the potential of plants. I mean, I've just beat my head against my computer for so long with comments, well, plants aren't a very good source of medicine. And I'm like, read your history. Yes, they are. This is why. Here's, you know, 24 examples of how we got, you know, therapies from plants. And I think that in some ways the tide is changing. I think there's a growing recognition of the value of plants, but it's been an uphill battle to really prove that what we're doing is a valid approach to science, and it's a rigorous approach to science.
Well, thank you. There's 1 minute left. Is there any other, I mean, you've covered so many important topics.
Yeah.
There's
I guess, yeah, I would just encourage folks that are interested in nature, especially in medicinal plants, check out the book. You can head to my website at cassandraquave.com for an upcoming list of events. I'm doing some in-person events here locally in Georgia. I'm going to be popping over to the UK in a couple of weeks to do some events there as well, and those will be up soon. And just to encourage anyone that's starting off in science, it's an incredibly amazing field to be in. And I think, building your networks of friends and collaborators, and just really thinking about your work in a global context is so important.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.